We've Been Around the Block is a podcast coming to you from the heart of the KZN Midlands. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Antony Jarvie, and today's guest is Grant Pringle. Grant is a product agronomist with Pannar Seed, and he is a repeat guest on this show. You're very welcome, Grant.
Thank you very much for having me back, Ant.
So, Grant, we are barely through last season and already we're looking towards next season. With that in mind, there are a couple of issues around soybean maturity that I'd like to discuss. And perhaps what we could do today is look at soybean maturity. What is soybean maturity? What influences maturity and how is it calculated? And then I think what is important is also why is soybean maturity important and how would you, as a producer, utilize this knowledge in terms of your cultivars?
Great, and I think that'll be a very full topic to discuss, and I'm sure we can help unpack this for your listeners so that they get a nice clear understanding of how this all works and what it means for them as soybean producers.
Right, thanks. Right, so we'll have a short break and then we'll be back and have a good look at soybean maturity. This episode is sponsored by Pannar Seed. So let me tell you a little bit about the Pannar soybean cultivar range. It's a bit like shining a torch against the back of a door. And in this analogy, the torch is the cultivar and the back of the door is the soybean production area. So if you stand far enough back, with a single torch you can cover the entire door with diffuse light. But as the competition in the industry increases, diffuse light is not good enough and you need to move closer to get a sharper light. And as you move closer, less of the door becomes covered, which means that you need another torch. The South African soybean industry is now more competitive than ever, and most companies would need several cultivars to cover the soybean industry adequately. You could, of course, have too many varieties, making cultivar recommendations difficult, and this obviously also adds to the risk of the producer. Panna have a nice compact cultivar range of 6 varieties, which vary in maturity from 4.6 through to 6.7, and this means that they have a variety or 2 for your every need. I also happen to know that they will be launching 2 brand new varieties this coming season, so that's the 2021 season, a variety called Pan 1588R and Pan 1692R. And so if you really want to have the inside track on soybean production, you need to listen to this podcast. Right, back to the show. Today we are discussing soybean maturity. We know that genotypes vary in the genes they contain, which dictate their maturity. But we also know that maturity is very strongly influenced by environmental effects. So if we were to ignore the effects of genotype or ignore the effects of genes, let us unpack the environmental conditions which will dictate how long it takes for a cultivar to mature. Firstly, perhaps we should just define what we mean by maturity. When you say maturity, it actually means that the time it takes from planting through to harvest maturity, and that would vary based on temperature, based on day length.
For the same variety at different locations with different latitude and temperature regimes.
Right, yeah. So we use a relative maturity rather than an absolute maturity, and so you never say something is 120 day to harvest just because it might be considerably different at a different location, depending on planting date, depending on the height above sea level, which influences your temperature, depending on the latitude. Right, so maybe let's just give a couple of examples of that. So if you had a single variety which you planted in, say, Tabazimbi, and you also planted in Durban at the same planting date, and I know people don't plant soybeans in Durban, they plant Zol. But as an example, so they would be roughly on the same
temperature regime, more or less.
Yeah, but the difference there is probably 6 degrees in latitude. And so you would have the same variety taking 120 days to maturity in Tabazimbi and 130 days or 135 days in Durban. And that is the effect of day length, right?
So that shifting north-south between the two locations, keeping your temperature regime reasonably constant, influences the maturity or the days from planting to harvest ready of a particular soybean cultivar.
Yeah, and the way it does that is actually the flowering of the variety is dictated by both temperature and day length. And so it's actually it's the days to flower that are affected by the day length. And so from planting to flowering, the stimulation to get the variety to flower would be the combination of both day length and temperature. And flowering would happen roughly in the middle of the growing season, and so that also then affects when the variety would mature. So that was the effect of latitude or day length. If we look at a similar example of the effect of temperature, so if we used Greytown, which is at an altitude of about 1,000 meters above sea level, and Moy River, and Greytown and Moy River are roughly on the same latitude, so there's no differential effect of photoperiod. So,
and actually only about 45 minutes drive between the two of them, so they're very close geographically as well.
Yes, so they're very close together, but they probably differ in about 400 meters in terms of altitude. And so Moy River is vastly cooler than Greytown. And so you may have a variety at the same planting date in Greytown taking 130 days to mature, and that variety taking 145 days in Moy River. And so that is the effect of temperature.
So that's giving you some indication of why it's important to be able to class your soybean varieties into these maturity groups, because it's going to influence your growing season in your particular location. And if you're choosing the wrong maturity group, you can possibly run into problems of the season cutting you short and getting caught out by frost or lack of heat units at the end of the season, and that could severely impact yield.
Right. So the system we use, rather than using an absolute value like a number of days, is a relative system, and it's a system that is used all around the world, and it's called relative maturity, and cultivars are classed based on a biological control. And so if we say 5.5 in South Africa, that 5.5 would be a similar value in Brazil, in the US, in Argentina.
So it's a worldwide scale. It's influenced by those two criteria of latitude and temperature. So wherever you take those products across the world, in a similar environment, you would expect a similar response in terms of number of days.
Yeah. So in South Africa, we utilize varieties which fall in between maturity group 4.5 through to about 7.5. And globally, the scale works from 0 all the way through to maturity group of 9. And so the 0s would be better adapted closer to the poles, and the maturity group 9s would be better adapted to your tropical environments around the equator. And so if we look at a country like the United States that has these massive Great Plains, these plains have very little variation in altitude. So they're all sitting at roughly the same height above sea level. And so the latitude plays a massive role in determining which varieties are planted where. And so you'd see these bands of adaptation running across sort of concentrically from the poles, and closest to the poles, sort of in Canada and the northern US, you'd have 0s and 0s working your way gradually down closer to the equator where your maturity group 8s, and actually when you get down onto the equator, you'd have these very tropically adapted varieties, maturity group 9s. And so they have a very, very nice, clear system. It's not the same for us, right?
Yeah, so in America, with as you've described it, with those big Great Plains, and as you come down the country from Canada, your classes will slowly start to get longer coming down towards the tropics from your very polar regions. And that's, as you say, because all you're changing is your latitude. In South Africa, it's a very different situation. Most of our cropping happens in quite a narrow band in terms of latitude. But if you consider the climate zones from the Midlands of KZN through to the central Free State regions, the climate changes significantly. And temperature regimes and the rate at which heat units accumulate are extremely different in those two extreme environments.
Yeah, and so our adaptation map would look more like a contour map, because what's driving our soybean adaptation is temperature, which is driven by height above sea level.
Okay, so our maturity groups in your cooler environments, your earlier maturity groups from 4.5 to probably 5.5 to 6, do much better in those cooler environments. And then when you get to your hotter environments, you go from probably from 6 through to 7.5. That's where the adaptation of those longer varieties will come in those hotter environments.
Right. Maybe what we just need to touch on is how do we actually go about giving any particular variety a maturity group, right? And so this is not random.
Although in some instances one gets the feeling that they are randomly allocated.
Yeah, that maybe a little bit of thumb sucking has happened in the past. So if we think that at some stage South Africa would have had to start using this global system, the way we got going in the start was we would have at least 2 reference varieties. So if you'd have, say, a maturity group 5 that you know is maturity group 5 in the US or in Argentina or wherever, and say a maturity group 7, then what you would be able to do is work out at the same planting date for those 2 varieties what the difference was in terms of maturity. So the one would say mature in 120 days and the other 2 weeks later. And if you plot a straight line between these two, you'd say each maturity group was roughly worth 7 days. And then using that formula, you could then work out, based on those 2 varieties, where all the other varieties fitted in terms of the maturity group classing. And so once you've got this system going, it's then quite easy to take the varieties that you've already classified and put them into a regression, which is essentially just plotting the varieties and fitting a line into that. And so on the one side you would have the maturity groups, and on the other side you would have the days to maturity, and you plot a line. And you use this line to then inform you
of where your new varieties fit in on that scale.
Yes.
And that's basically the
you would say
simple method that is used to ascribe a maturity group onto a new cultivar.
Yeah, so you'd say, okay, well, this thing took 133 days to maturity, and you plot up to the line and back to the axis, and it tell you it's 5.6 or whatever it is. And so that's a very simple way, and really everybody within the South African soybean industry needs to be utilizing the same system so that this is comparable across companies, across the industry in South Africa.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important aspect. And if you start comparing cultivars and you're comparing cultivars in the same maturity group against each other, and you have allocated a cultivar in there the wrong maturity grouping, either too short or too long for that particular group, it's either going to fail badly if you've allocated a too short a maturity class or a too early a maturity class, and it's going to win the yield trial very comfortably if it's from a higher maturity group than the batch that you're trying to compare.
Yeah, if you just think of something like maize, where you would say have 5 extra days in order to generate yield, that variety is definitely going to have a better chance of beating the one 5 days shorter. Yeah. And that is one of the reasons why we need to have a similar system to be able to class varieties, so that we are able to compare apples with apples. It's a bit like, if you have all your standard 5s line up for the 100 meters, but one of them has failed 3 or 4 times. He's going to be 16 years old and he's going to whoop everybody.
And he's got the long sideburns and the big moustache.
Yes. Yeah. So it's the same thing. So it's a way that we use the system to be able to classify varieties similarly. and it's very important in terms of doing our cultivar recommendations. Actually, it forms the basis of cultivar recommendation because maturity group is so important in terms of how varieties are adapted.
Yeah, so I think to that point, and as an agronomist, that is one of the key tools that we use when we advise clients on what cultivars that they should have in their package. And, it's all well and good to choose 4 or 5 different soybean cultivars, and it's probably also a good practice to choose them from a range of suppliers. But if you're choosing 4 different cultivars from 4 different companies, and they're all in the maturity group 5.5, for example, you've actually reduced your
risk
mitigation through your cultivar selection. So if you know the maturity groups, you can then spread those out depending on your size of your operation. You can help use that maturity grouping to spread your risk in terms of climatic risk, as well as your harvest risk at the end of the season. If you're planting a spread of maturity groups from early maturities through to late maturities, you're going to have that spread at harvest time too, that you're going to widen that harvest opportunity.
Right, so it's not only harvest, so obviously when you're planting, it gives you a bigger planting window if you have a wider range of maturity groups, right? And then you go through the season, you would be flowering at
different times,
at different times, and this is important in terms of your climate, not only rainfall and that, but also in terms of diseases. So your disease pressure and generally your flowering period dictates how susceptible a variety might well be to something like, say, sclerotinia or rust. And so having more than one flowering period within your group of cultivars is important. It's a good production practice to have a wide spread in your flowering. And then we come through to harvest, obviously. Depending on the scale of your operation, you may wish to spread your harvest period over a longer time.
Yeah, and you can tie this in with your machinery availability. If you're limited in terms of your harvest capacity, then this maturity grouping becomes even more important because you're able to then spread your harvest window over a wider period, and your one combine might be able to get through those 300 hectares if you've planted 3 different widely spaced maturity groups. But if you did the same number of hectares with one, say, for example, a quick maturity group, you may be very, very compromised when it comes to harvest, that you're halfway through and getting caught by rain and unpleasant harvest conditions, and you're unable to get through your harvest window or your harvest period with the equipment you have available.
Right, Grant. Before we wrap up the show, you guys at Panna have a fairly unique way of grouping your varieties together for cultivar recommendation. And so everybody does it based on maturity, but most companies would have 4 groups, so they would base their recommendations on whether the variety was in a maturity group 4, 5, 6 or 7, whereas you guys have a more simplified method where you've grouped the varieties still based on maturity, but into 3 groups. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we've tried to simplify it to some extent, and we've changed the boundaries on which we peg our maturity groups, and we've basically come up with 3 classes. The early group, which is maturity groups 4.5 through to 5.4. We have a medium group, which is your 5.5 to 6.4, and then your late group, which is 6.5 up to 7.5. So that's reduced the number or the complexity in our recommendations to some extent, because if you want an early, do you need a 4.6 or is a 5.3 going to be all right in terms of fitting the bill for that early segment? And from our perspective, we believe so long as you're in that early group, that early end of the spectrum, whether it's a 4 or an early 5, there's not going to be a huge management difference in terms of those products. The same with the longer grows, whether you have a 6.9 or a 7.2, it's not really going to change the recommendation to any great extent.
Right. So actually, the groups that you put them in are still only one maturity group wide.
That's correct, yes.
But it's really optimized for the range that we have in South Africa.
That's right, yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a wonderful system, and certainly cultivar recommendations is one of the more difficult aspects of soybean agronomy, right?
Correct.
And so well done to you guys to simplify this for the producer.
Very good.
Right. So, Grant, I think we should wrap up the discussion now. It's been wonderful chatting to you. And until next time, it's been a gas. Take care.